Hello, I'm Chris Hall. Welcome to CBC News Facebook Live on the Alberta Election campaign. Voters in this province go to the polls on Tuesday, and there's there's four parties in the race, but the two that seem to be dominating the discussion are the NDP under Rachel Notley, looking for a second term after winning in 2015, and Jason Kenney, who leads the United Conservative Party. They have offering starkly different views of the future, starkly different views of how to deal with the economy, on climate change and other issues. So we're looking forward to hearing your questions about this race and what it might mean for the national political scene, especially when we discuss the climate change. I'm joined today by Kim Trynacity. She's a provincial affairs reporter here in Alberta, a good friend of mine, and I'm glad to have her on board. Hello, Kim.
Hi there, Chris. It doesn't seem all that long ago, 4 years ago, we were in Calgary looking at our notes and wondering what was going on.
Well, this time I think we maybe have a better sense of it. You've been covering this campaign since it began, so walk us through how it's unfolded and what you're watching for.
Well, you know, in a sense, it feels like this campaign has been going on for a couple of years already. Well, maybe even 4 years since Rachel Notley surprisingly formed the first NDP government in Alberta. And ever since then, there was a concerted effort to unite the right, which Jason Kenney successfully did. Since the campaign started, it's been an all-out attack on Kenney and his candidates from the NDP, whereas Jason Kenney has been laser-focused on jobs, the economy, and pipelines. And, you know, if we had time, not that I'd do it, I could probably recite his entire stump speech, which has been going through the same themes over and over. You know, there haven't been any major turning points. Every so often there have been spikes when we've learned more about investigations into the UCP leadership race from 2017. Our colleague Carolyn Dunn and others in Calgary and within the CBC have been bringing us stories about the latest development on that front. There's currently an investigation by the RCMP and Alberta's Election Commissioner. So there are things, so we've had spikes of interest on that front, but then it always comes back to the state of the economy. How is Alberta doing? Where are people hurting? And what are the plans going forward? Because Alberta is not used to being in a sustained economic downturn. We have seen examples where it has rebounded somewhat, but then pulled back a bit. We're not in another recession, but we're not back where we were just a few years ago.
All right. Kim, you know, you mentioned the investigation that's underway into Jason Kenney's leadership or to the UCP leadership. And that's one of the first questions we got from Siri Eva on YouTube. He asked, does Alberta Elections have the power to postpone this race and take action on the Kenney campaign team until this whole issue is resolved? I'm not sure I have the answer for that, but do you?
Well, you know, I don't have it in front of me, but I don't think they do. I'm not sure what would have or who would have the power to hold off a provincial election. Perhaps it might be the Lieutenant Governor, but there are limited powers that the Elections Commissioner does have, but it's quasi-judicial. So he can take some legal action to a certain extent, but I can pretty much say that he does not have the authority within his mandate to say, sorry, no election here.
Right. In fact, it seems just the opposite. There was an effort to try to stop the investigation until after the election. So it's really the other way around. A judge refused that request. So obviously it continues. You know, I've been here for about a week now, and I haven't heard a lot about that part of it, you know, the concerns that people might have about that leadership race. As you said, everything we hear about is the uncertainty about jobs, about the economy, the concerns that no matter what happens, it's still going to be some time before Alberta fully recovers. The jobless rate here running above the national average, although it's come down recently. And it seems to me that that's the issue, and like most campaigns, but in this particular case, Kim, the real sense of uncertainty dominates almost every discussion I've had, whether it's in rural parts of the province or here in Calgary.
For sure. And, you know, most of the campaign, the races and the leaders have been outside of Edmonton, have been in places like Calgary or places outside of, you know, I was in Fort McMurray yesterday, for example. And here's a bit of a background. I mean, the city of Edmonton, when it comes right down to it, is still a government town, so to speak. A large employer is the provincial government, the University of Alberta. Yeah. And Edmonton was not as hard hit as other parts of the province economically. So when the downturn hit, Edmonton didn't feel that dramatic impact that you see evidence of in downtown Calgary with the empty office buildings. So, you know, when Jim Prentice brought out, you know, the last budget for the last provincial election, there were concerns about the impact in a place like Edmonton and the The economist for the city of Edmonton at one point was cautioning against any dramatic cuts to the civil service because of the economic effect it was going to have in Edmonton. So your initial question, I'm sorry what it was, but it all comes back to jobs in the economy. And if I can relate an experience yesterday in Fort McMurray, even going up to Fort McMurray, I haven't been there in about a year and a half or so. And I was curious to see what it would look like after the fires. I was there immediately after, and now it's some time since. Sure, there is some rebuilding, and there is building going on. But when you talk to people, the population has really dropped, and they are nowhere near where they were a few years ago. Even a woman on the plane was telling me she was with a storage company, long-term storage, and she said they're only about 50% capacity, and most of their business is of people taking out stuff and moving away, not coming in.
Okay. Kim, I just want to remind people we're on Facebook Live and we're taking your questions. If you have them, please forward them, and we're also on YouTube and Twitter. Here's one from Montreal, Charlie, also from YouTube, who asks, do the minor parties, the Liberal Party, the Alberta Party, have a chance to win any seats? My first answer, anytime you have parties that are not necessarily at the top in terms of what the polls suggest, it depends on how broadly spread their support is. If it's concentrated, for example, the Liberal Party, if their vote strength is concentrated in and around Calgary, there might be a chance to win a seat. But the first past the post system tends to favor those parties that are the big parties, who have support that is not just concentrated in seats but spread right across the province. I don't know, Kim, what you're thinking. Certainly the Alberta Party, in talking, especially in rural areas, some people are paying attention to what the Alberta has to say, because Alberta Party has to say, because they're not necessarily sold on Jason Kenney and the UCP or Rachel Notley and the NDP.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure this is their election, though. There is increasing interest in the Alberta Party because the roots of it, this isn't the first election that they've had, but I think it's safe to say they've never had attention that they do right now in previous elections. Part of it is because of what happened with the United Conservative Party, and there were a large group of disaffected PCers who refused to join the United Conservative Party. Right. It's a relative term when you say large, and they're still wondering, where do they go? Where do they park their vote? Do they stay at home? They aren't comfortable with the NDP. They're looking for a middle ground. But at this point, it doesn't seem like there's a huge surge or uptick. They have a very good chance of getting a seat in Calgary Elbow. That's Greg Clark. He was their elected MLA in the last legislature. There are a couple of candidates here that have some chance, but I'm not sure, including leader Stephen Mandel, but he's in a bit of a very tight race where he's running. Catherine O'Neill, she was a former Globe and Mail reporter, was a PCer, and then left to join the Alberta Party. She's running. She's in a tough fight as well, too. So it doesn't appear that at this point the other parties, other than the two major parties, will have a big impact, but we'll see. Okay. Maybe next time.
Okay. I have another question from Carlo Villarreal on YouTube, who asked, would there be any repercussions on Albertans in pulling out of the carbon tax? I can give you a good sense of that one. If Jason Kenney were to win and he scraps the carbon plan that's in place here, the federal government's carbon price would be imposed, as it has been on other provinces, including Ontario and New Brunswick, who have refused on their own to put a price on carbon. And that's one of the big issues, and why this election has really national implications as we head into the prospect of a fall election campaign in which climate change will be an issue. So make no mistake, if Jason Kenney does win and he does proceed with his plan to get out on a price on carbon and to get rid of the cap on carbon emissions, that will clearly be a huge issue, and Albertans will end up paying that price. If you listen to the Conservatives, they say it's a tax basically on everything, and certainly at the pump. I'm from Ontario. At the pump, prices went up about 5 cents a litre when the carbon backstop that the federal government has put in of $20 a ton when it kicked in. So there will be an immediate difference if you are looking at what the gasoline prices, what home heating oil, those types of things would cost. I know that's been an issue here, Kim. Is a sense of the sense of how much it would impact the economy here and how much individual homeowners, for example, might pay?
People aren't really listening. They just want to get rid of the carbon tax that's been imposed provincially. The message that it's going to be replaced by the federal carbon tax isn't resonating, really. For people who stop to think about it and look at their bills, then they get it. They know what's coming. But others, when you hear that message over and over again, I'm going to get rid of the carbon tax, there's almost a sense that, good, I'm not going to be paying as much, or I won't be paying that tax that's been imposed arbitrarily.
Yeah, don't want to burst that bubble, but it's coming. If that happens, it's coming.
It is. I think an average homeowner pays about $1,200 a year. I'm not exactly sure what the exact number is. Many Albertans do receive a rebate from the provincial carbon tax. But if you're a middle wage earner, if you're, say, a teacher, for example, or a nurse, you're not getting a rebate. You are if you're, making less.
If I could, Kim, though, one of the things that the federal government, the federal Liberals have said is there will be rebates for families that pay the carbon price. That's what's happening in Ontario. Those checks, or that, not really getting checks, but you'll feel it when your income tax return is filed, because they don't want individual to pay the price. They want to influence how much consumption, how much fuel you use, how much carbon pollution you put out, but they don't want to hit people in the pocketbook, which has been an interesting concept. Most people in a recent poll had already felt they were paying the carbon tax in a place like Ontario when they in fact weren't. So it's not clear exactly how it would roll out here, but I think the same program would be in effect, where the rebate would come from the federal government to offset for most families the cost of what the carbon price would impose on them as they make their purchases. Let me move on to another question here on CBC News on Facebook Live, Twitter, and YouTube. I have one here from it's an interesting question. I'm not sure quite how to answer this one. This was from Christine Laurie on Facebook, who asked, what are the numbers looking like? Well, there's a poll probably coming out in the next day or two, but the original lead that the UCP had seems to have narrowed somewhat. Kim, any sense of what the next set of numbers might look like?
Well, we just came from a training session with Bob Weers, the guy who comes into every election, provincial election, and sets up the system, and he walks us through the way that the decision desk operates. And one of the points he made was that, keep this in mind, that in the last election in 2015, Rachel Notley formed the government with the lowest ever popular vote in Alberta history, 38.7% popular vote. And that stuck in my mind because it really enforces the reality that Rachel Notley has to do even better than she did in 2015 to form a government. So her task is huge, right? And in terms of what the numbers are looking like now, where you are, Chris, I mean, we do hear that the races are narrowing in Calgary, but how much, really? That's the big unknown.
And just to remind folks, Calgary, the NDP won 15 seats in Calgary, which was historic, obviously, as well as winning and forming the first government. So, and Rachel Notley has spent much of the past week, and I think she will continue to spend time here, which at least suggests that she believes there are seats that can still be held in the city.
And there are some, the way Edmonton is now shaped, I mean, the lines were redrawn, the ridings were redrawn after the last provincial election. So there are some ridings in Edmonton that are part rural, part urban, and have been redrawn. The inner core of Edmonton is considered to be very safe NDP seats, and we've seen no sign that that's going to change. Some ridings that were held for a long time by Alberta Liberals, they're not even running a candidate anymore. But the NDP appear to be still maintaining a strength in the city of Edmonton. There's one riding that's really interesting for me to watch, and that's called Edmonton Meadows. I don't think it's going to be typical, but it's kind of an interesting seat to watch because it has a very large Southeast Asian community. There was a very intense competition for the UCP candidate to be named to an election selection process, and then all of a sudden Jason Kenney dropped in a parachute candidate who is not from the community, and he was the former president of the Edmonton Eskimos, Len Rhodes, who lives on the other side of the city. So he wasn't a member of the community. He was parachuted in, and that caused people who were trying to get to the leadership or who were trying to become the candidate to be very upset. Some of them signed up like 2,000 people, new members, to join in this campaign. So I'm keeping my eye on that. I'm not saying that that's going to be an indication, but what has been said to me, if Jason Kenney does well, like better than expected, that's one of the seats that the UCP could win that really the NDP should hang on to, because they have a local community member running and support has gone his way because of Jason Kenney's decision to drop in a candidate there arbitrarily.
I have an interesting question. We've talked a lot about the economy and the anxiety that people feel about jobs and for the future, but Marilyn Nash on Facebook asks a really good question. Accepting other than Trans Mountain Pipeline, what were Notley's efforts to get other pipelines approved for Alberta? Just to remind folks, it's actually the federal government that has the authority to approve interprovincial pipelines, either running from Alberta to British Columbia. Northern Gateway was one that was on the books that the government said it wasn't going to proceed with that. There was Energy East, which was withdrawn by its proponent, TransCanada. And as a result, we're really left with the expansion of Trans Mountain, and it is obviously a significant issue. I heard Rachel Notley earlier this week saying that she believes it will be approved by next month, which is when the consultations with Indigenous groups that have been ordered, the extra consultations with Indigenous groups that have been ordered by a federal court of appeal judge are expected to be finished. We've already heard from the National Energy Board approving some of the plans that have been made to deal with impacts on marine life and the like. So I'm not sure if Rachel Notley had many other options, frankly, and Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, but Trans Mountain was really the only one that was in the offing by the time she came to power.
Well, there were a couple of others. Remember, there's Keystone going down to the States, right?
Yes, true.
The expansion of the Keystone XL and Line 3 expansion. So those two, there was a court decision recently with regard to Line 3, and then Keystone seems to be off and on and off and on, and it's like, Donald Trump
south
came
of the
in
border,
and
the
he
United
said,
States is the one where all the challenges are taking place.
Yeah, exactly. And so that, I mean, there are a lot of complaints about the difficulty in trying to get a pipeline approved and built and up and running in Canada. Well, look what's happening to the Keystone down to the States, too. But, in answer to that question, her focus has been on Trans Mountain. And one of the things that we've heard Jason Kenney repeat ever since he came in, became leader, really, is he created the image of this unholy alliance, if you like, between Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau. Right. And he has just he's hammered that home. That was the first time we heard that really in a big way is when he won a seat in the Alberta legislature, and he walked into the first question period and he kept on talking about Justin Trudeau and Rachel Notley. And at the time I was thinking, well, Justin Trudeau doesn't hold a seat in the Alberta legislature, what's going on? But what he was doing is very clever. Justin Trudeau does not have a big following. He doesn't have a lot of support in Alberta just by virtue of the number of seats he doesn't have. And he created the image that the two were in cahoots, that they were working together. Right. In part, I mean, he's not entirely wrong because there was an agreement. Rachel Notley said, look, I wasn't in the room, but this is what it appears happened. You approved Trans Mountain, and we'll bring in our climate change plan, with the carbon tax. This is what we'll do, and then everything fell off the rails.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, just so people who are watching might not know, but Andrew Scheer is in town tonight to appear with Jason Kenney. And it's not because the Conservatives see this as a big battleground, because they own most of the seats and likely will even pick up some of those that they don't, but it is an ally, another ally. If Jason Kenney is to win, it's another ally, as I alluded to earlier, another provincial premier, another Conservative who is diametrically opposed to a carbon price and is pro-energy sector. Which leads me to another question. This is actually quite a good one. This is from, well, I've lost it here. Oh, yes. Chris Wilkstrom on Facebook is asking, how will Jason Kenney's lowering of corporate taxes actually do anything to help other than increase debt and lower tax income? It's interesting. I've looked at the platforms of the two parties, and obviously Jason Kenney is reverting to what most conservative parties in this country have said. If you lower corporate taxes, investment will increase, jobs will be created, the economic activity will be regained, and that is true to a certain point. But there are other issues here. If you reduce revenues for the province, that you can't afford some of the programs that are essential. Like, for example, healthcare expansion, teachers, schools, these types of things sometimes have to face cuts. It's not usually possible to lower taxes without lowering spending. I don't know if Kenney has actually gone into great detail about how he will review, what he will be reviewing if he forms government, but clearly the NDP has said we are prepared to invest in things like healthcare, in things like childcare. Has that been a big issue over the last couple of weeks, Kim?
Well, the NDP has tried to raise it, saying, where are you going to fill the hole? What are you going to do? If you freeze spending for health and education, that leaves a X billion-dollar hole in the budget, because you have to fund for increase population and enrollment. But maybe you can't, you don't have to, in which case it would result in a cut to education and healthcare. So the NDP have tried to raise these questions, but it hasn't got a whole lot of traction. But it raises the question of, if you do cut the corporate income tax or corporate tax, is that going to incent enough investment in the province to increase the revenue that comes to the province through personal income taxes and corporate income taxes? Is that going to create some activity and the climate where business wants to invest? We've heard repeatedly over the last 4 years, oh, we're not going to invest in Alberta, or Alberta is not a business-friendly environment anymore. But I mean, clearly there are businesses that are thriving here in Alberta. Not all the shops have closed up. I mean, the marijuana industry alone is very big. There are very large operations outside of the Edmonton International Airport, very big businesses. So it hasn't all closed up, but Kenney is promising, is hoping that by cutting that corporate tax, it's going to spur investment, and we'll see more activity and more private sector jobs.
It's also interesting, one of the provinces that had the best record of economic growth is in fact next door in British Columbia, where there's been a price on carbon for some time, and investment has tended to be in green technologies and these kinds of things. So there isn't necessarily a direct correlation with having a price on carbon, for example, in economic growth, but even having higher corporate taxes, that's in a way discourages people from investing. So there are other issues that are at play just beyond that corporate tax. Let's continue to look, just to remind people, this is CBC News on Facebook Live. You can also watch on YouTube and Twitter. We're talking about the Alberta Election campaign. Voters going to the polls on Tuesday. I'm joined by Kim Trynacity in Edmonton. I'm Chris Hall here in Calgary. I wanted to read a question here from Jared Berry on Facebook and ask, is there a positive correlation between attitudes towards immigration and the perceived state of Alberta's economy, and how is that reflected in the platforms? Immigration is a huge issue nationally, obviously, that trying to bring in more people because of lower population growth. I'm always struck when I come back to Alberta by how diverse the population here is and how young it is. I believe it remains the youngest mean average or average age of any of the provinces in Canada. So immigration has been a net positive. Kim, I haven't heard a lot about it in this election campaign. I don't think it's a huge issue. Maybe I've missed it.
Every so often Jason Kenney will refer to different parts of his platform that address new Canadians and the difficulty they might have with attaining a certification in a certain field or trade. So this has come up once in a while, but it hasn't been a big thing, not a major thing. We looked at, for example, the roster of candidates. We found the Alberta Party is the most diverse, but are there specific elements of each party platform that sheds a very bright light on immigration or new Canadians or diversity? Not really. Perhaps the NDP, but I don't have it right in front of me to say this section and that section. But Jason Kenney does try to talk about it frequently, and he has made concerted efforts to dive into large ethnic communities, as he did when he was a federal minister, to gain support, to learn what's on their minds, and to tailor some of his policies to these communities.
Okay, I want to move on to another question. It's from Montreal Charlie on YouTube, who asks, are there bellwether ridings to keep an eye on? And the answer, of course, is yes, there are. Here in Calgary, there's obviously a couple, and but I'll start with you, Kim. Give me maybe one or two that you're keeping an eye on.
Well, I want to look at Calgary Buffalo, for example. That's where the finance minister. Darn. Okay, good. Calgary Buffalo, the finance minister, Joe Ceci, is running there. He's running against Tom Olson, who's the UCP candidate. Tom, I think it might be the first time Tom is running. He used to be a communications guy. He was a writer with the Calgary Herald. He was a journalist. He worked in communications for Ed Stelmach. And so he's running against Ceci. But the reason I mentioned Joe Ceci is because he was one of the few winners in Calgary that won despite a vote split. Like, he would have won regardless if there was a split or not. Right. Whereas there were some other candidates, such as Ricardo Miranda, for example, in another Calgary riding, who only won by like 10 votes or something like that, like double digits only, where it's going to be very difficult for him to win again in Calgary. But that's one of the ridings I'm watching, Calgary Buffalo. I mentioned Edmonton Meadows, just because it's kind of quirky, it's different, and I'm not sure if it's going to go against the trend. I think I'm also curious as to what happens in a place like Slave Lake, where A prominent cabinet minister, Daniel Larrivee, she was Children's Services Minister, is running. She had very close ties with the community. She worked as a social worker, worked with First Nations, and a relatively high profile. It's part urban, part rural. So that's a riding where you can't just write it off saying it's going UCP, because there were specific issues, I think, that the NDP targeted, like the $25 a day daycare. That message really resonates with young families, for example.
Let me ask you about Shannon Phillips in Lethbridge West, I think it is, right? Because when I was here 4 years ago for the election campaign, the NDP took seats in Red Deer and Lethbridge. Shannon Phillips may be the least of the surprising in that, because she'd been active for a long time. Is that one that you're keeping an eye on?
Oh, for sure. In fact, Rachel Notley is going there before Election Day. And I was thinking, why is she going there? Is that because Shannon Phillips is going to have a hard time keeping her seat? Right. Is it just to shore up her campaign? Shannon Phillips has become a lightning rod, because she is the Environment Minister, and she doesn't hold back, right? She is, you talk to her, and she's very quick with a response. Right. She's probably one of the more prominent performers from the Notley cabinet, who you remember. She took on a huge portfolio and she ran with it. And she's a longtime environmental activist, so she knows this file very well. So I wouldn't doubt if Kenney in the back of his mind is thinking, boy, we'd really like to get that seat. I'm not sure exactly how it's going, but that would be a very big target for the UCP Kenney team to unseat.
Just a little bit more broadly too, you read and certainly from experience, you know that Alberta's kind of three separate sort of electoral blocks. There's Edmonton, there's Calgary, and there's kind of the rest of Alberta. You have to win 2 of 3 generally to be able to form a government. And last time that was the NDP, it was Calgary and obviously Edmonton, with a smattering of seats elsewhere. I look at some of these rural bodies. We were just in West Yellowhead visiting Edson, which is a major pipe storage facility for the Trans Mountain Pipeline, where things were looking great. People were moving in, buying homes. The hotels were filled. There was lots of activity, and then the construction was halted by that federal court of appeal ruling, and the air went out of the place. Talking to the mayor up there, Kevin Zahara, he said, "Look, I can't tell you who's going to win, but he's a former conservative aide here in Edmonton. But he said, like, if you look at the Alberta Party, it's potentially possible that they might pick up some seats. But there's a sense in a community like that, this will be a flip because of that economic anxiety, because of the importance that pipeline has in the northern part, well, it's not northern, the western part of the province. And I wonder from your standpoint, as you look around, is there a single rural seat that might be a surprise?
There are always surprises, I was surprised to hear that Kevin Zahara was saying that perhaps the Alberta Party might do well there, so that would come as a surprise. Banff Kananaskis, I think the NDP has a strong candidate running there. And who is well liked, so that might, the NDP might be able to retain that. But you're quite right when you talk about how the air has really come out of a lot of communities because of that federal court decision. I mean, regardless of whose decision it was, the air came out of the NDP. Yeah. And people are blaming Rachel Notley for the fact that she's not digging the hole herself to get the pipeline in the ground. I mean, I was thinking back to last summer in July, and I did. There was a news conference just west of Edmonton, and it was a new storage facility that was opening up and being put in place because the First Nations community there was part of the operation. I mean, this was a big thing for them. I haven't been back there since because I think it never got off the ground. Nothing really happened to it. So it is, Rachel Notley is wearing the federal court decision. There is no doubt about that. Right. And people who really stop to think and realize, hey, it's not her decision, it takes a lot to get through the different layers to realize that it wasn't her decision. So the economy is bad, you blame the current government. Clearly
not her decision, because a decision's coming in May and she has to go to the polls before that. I have time for one more question, and I want to read one from Brittany Riley on Facebook, who asks, do statistics, as I think she means, do the numbers show that running negative campaigns turn out to be a positive impact in the polls? You know, we've seen increasingly, at least at the federal level, that negative campaigns are part and parcel of how modern campaigns are run. It's not just about promoting yourself and your platform. It's also about pointing out the problems with your opponent and how their policies won't work. And increasingly, it's become very personal. There's a real schism, a real polarization in politics, and I think for sure that's been the case here in Alberta. We've heard the concerns about the leadership race. We've heard the NDP repeatedly talking about some of the UCP candidates who have said things that are misogynistic, anti-gay, including Jason Kenney's own experience back when he was in San Francisco as a young man. You know, I think it's here for the while. I don't know if you can say it has necessarily been a positive. There are a lot of people who believe negative campaigning turns voters off and actually has the reverse effect. But clearly in this campaign and what we've seen federally the last time, I think that negative campaigning is part and parcel now of how any modern electoral campaign is run. And Kim, I know you have some thoughts on this as well.
I'm just thinking, yeah, I think it's here to stay. And despite the fact that people say, we don't like it, we want to hear policies, everyone is interested. Everyone reads this stuff or pays attention to it, if not, if just for a moment. And it tends to put an impression about a candidate or a party in a person's head. If the attack is personal, if it talks about what candidate X said 10 years ago or 5 years ago, people are still interested in reading that kind of stuff. And I don't think we're going to see the end of it. No. If anything, I'm curious to see I'm just really wondering what's going to happen in Calgary, because, you know, people in Edmonton know, you know, who Jason Kenney is. They are kind of more attuned to what's been going on. For some people, maybe all this is coming as a big surprise. What I can say clearly is if Mr. Kenney forms a government, a lot will be known about his MLAs, right? It'll come as no surprise. There's not going to be any, oh, we found this skeleton in the closet. No, that's because we did a story about it, you know, a month ago or something like that. I think it's here to say. I also think that people might be becoming a bit desensitized by all these so-called bozo eruptions, because you can look on how many Facebook pages or Twitter feeds and think, okay, there's a bozo, there's an eruption, there's someone saying bizarre. I don't know if it still has the same effect, but I still think people want to know about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. With social media in particular, with the internet, you really can't escape things that you've done in the past. No. And the vetting process that various parties are supposed to put in place really can't catch everything. I'd add one other thing. Clearly, it's worked south of the border, and we get inundated with U.S. news. But Donald Trump polarizing the population is exactly how he got elected and how he intends to remain or to win again if that's what's going to happen a year from now. So it has worked, and people have seen the results of that, accusing your opponents of not only being wrong, but being enemies of the state, like the media, for example, in Donald Trump's words. So I think we've seen a lot of this. I wish we had more time. I've actually got to move on. I've got another interview to do. Kim Trynacity in Edmonton, thank you so much for your insights. And thanks to all of you who have sent questions here on CBC News, Facebook Live, YouTube, and Twitter. Really appreciate it, and I hope we can do this again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the questions, and keep watching, especially on election night.
Right. Thanks again, Kim.
Bye-bye.